Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this public lecture series of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. We have the great pleasure and honor of having with us today a very distinguished speaker, Ambassador Sujan R. Chinoy, who is currently the Director General of Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. Um, Ambassador Chinoy has had a very distinguished career. He was India's ambassador to Japan and Mexico and High Commissioner of India to Belize and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. A specialist on China with over 2 decades of hands-on experience, he headed the Indian expert group dealing with the boundary dispute and confidence-building measures. Ambassador Chinoy contributes extensively to newspapers and journals, besides lecturing in India and overseas. This lecture has been in waiting for a long time, and I had requested him some months ago, and I'm very happy that finally he has been able to find the time. And I must say that especially on this subject of India and China in a changing world order, Ambassador Chinoy is one of the most suitable persons to speak with a degree of clarity and authority. So it gives me added pleasure to receive him here today. The topic of his lecture, India and China and a Changing World Order, as I said, is very important. In the last 30 years, one can say that three major events have happened that have defined and changed and regulated what we generally call the world order. The first, of course, was the disintegration of the USSR, and then in 2008, the great economic recession. And I would say that Corona, of course, is the third event or episode which is going to have, and which already has had, in fact, a determining or rather defining impact on the world order. So these three events, and especially the last two of them, I think are very important in shaping the current world order which we are experiencing. And of course, then India and China in history at present, which is the second part of his lecture. We know that for most of human history, India and China, they were the most populous countries, and they were the largest economies. China is generally highlighted as far as this role is concerned, but the fact that for most of human history, India had a larger population than China and probably a larger economy as well is often not recognized as much as it should be. But this is what the truth is. It is only during the British rule that mainly one can say that China was able to sort of overtake India's population and India's economy over a sustained period. Before that, that is before 1750, there were some short periods when China was able to overtake India in terms of its GDP or population. But in a sustained manner, it happened from 1820 onward. And of course, that trend then continued, and it continues today. But of course, India and China, as I said, they have been there as the in a way the most important players in the world economy, and the world economic system for thousands of years has been centered on the Indian Ocean, where I would say India's role was even more central than that of China. So now we know that after 2008, China has changed its posture in many ways, and it has given up the sage advice of Deng Xiaoping of not antagonizing people, of not changing, of not taking lead, etc. And it has in fact concluded that now it has arrived, and therefore it can take aggressive positions. So that is also another factor which we are witnessing in the world order today. So without further delay now, with this brief introduction, I would like to invite Ambassador Chinoy to proceed with his lecture.
Thank you very much, Dr. R.K. Mishra. You have very ably summarized the topic for my lecture today. And I wish to thank you for that generous introduction, though I often see myself as an extinguished ambassador, not so much a distinguished one anymore. But this is a very important topic today, and let me acknowledge that the three factors or points of inflection that you mentioned in the changing world order are all very relevant. For the disintegration of the USSR that you mentioned gave rise to a kind of unipolar world, a unipolar decade of the 1990s, which is also a matter of the past now. The 2008 global financial and economic crises led China to acquire much greater confidence, and at a time when the United States was preoccupied with the global war on terror, China was also able to occupy that vacuum, including on its geographical periphery, in terms of also front-loading the global developmental and other systems with its own brand of developmental finance and creating dependencies in the bargain. And the coronavirus, of course, has laid bare the vulnerabilities and frailties of many nations. And there too, China has acquired a certain profile, having followed some kind of a zero COVID policy, and also having supposedly controlled it and ostensibly also revived its economy before anybody else could. So these are very good in terms of vectors for analysis. But I would also like to take you back very briefly to what has really changed and what has not changed. And when we look back at the world order as it was created in 1945, with the victors also deciding as to who would be the 5 permanent members, what strikes me is that except for one, the other 4 did not have nuclear weapons at that point of time in 1945. So in other words, sitting at the high table in 1945 in the UN Security Council had little to do, as we look back, with nuclear weapons per se. Although today we do not draw a distinction between the permanent members of the Security Council and the P5 in terms of possession of nuclear weapons per se, at least in terms of the definitional aspects of the NPT. The second point that strikes one is that over the last 75, 76 odd years, it is also very clear that economic development, the delivery of economic prosperity, is no longer the monopoly of capitalism, which it once was. And so one can ponder over this a little more, because there was a time when the likes of Henry Kissinger also averred that the Soviet model could not really deliver economic prosperity, though it might be able to deliver a certain kind of security and military posturing. So that has changed fundamentally. Today it is not just capitalism that delivers or does not adequately deliver economic prosperity, but you also have various versions of state capitalism and that includes the system that China follows, that are known for delivering a certain kind of rapid economic growth and prosperity. So I think that's a fundamental shift in what we see as change in the order per se, in terms of some of the ideational aspects. Democracy too, once a monopoly of liberal democracies and parliamentary democracies, as we once understood it, is no longer a monopoly of democracies as we understand them. Today, democracy itself has been purloined by what one might call the illiberal systems and authoritarian systems. In fact, China too, in its white paper that came out recently on democracies, a kind of riposte to the Summit of Democracies, has adopted democracy, in fact, projected it as something that China has always followed, and has also cast its own system, that is the Communist Party of China and its attendant structural elements like the NPC and the CPPCC, as nothing but the highest epitomes of the practice of democracy. So this whole process democracy that the Chinese have now projected to the rest of the world, to me, is like defining the pinnacle of democracy having taken roots nowhere else but in China. Well, there is a fine example of this in Chinese history, because we as students of China also believe that Tang culture never really fully blossomed in China itself, though China is known for its Tang culture and the kind of cultural effervescence that took place in China during that period. But one might say and argue that the one country where Tang culture actually achieved its height of success was really in Japan. And so therefore I can understand what the Chinese are trying to say now with regard to their newfound zeal for democracy. And one big change there that I notice is that in the past, they did speak of people's democratic dictatorship. That is one of the cardinal principles, and China has always said that since the founding of the People's Republic of China. But this time around, democracy is not being cast in that broad sense of people's democratic dictatorship. This time around, it is a purloining of democracy as the rest of the world understands it, and that is what China says it is best at today, having also demonstrated in its view the success of its governance and developmental models, more particularly in the aftermath of the corona pandemic. But before I get led away, let me show you a few slides, and let me begin with the proposition that India, China, are neighbors. We have a deep historical connect, and whatever we analyze today as relations between India and China must be seen in the context of a fundamental reality that we have a geographical connect that cannot be wished away no matter how the world changes. So regardless of what else is happening out there in terms of the world order, a changing order, or a frozen order, the fact of the matter is that we have coexisted cheek by jowl for thousands of years, and we are either, one might say, condemned, for want of a better word, but we have to live with one another for many, many centuries to come. And when we look at our ties, I tend to think that we have also overrated our historical connect. And scholars might dispute that, but our ties were episodic at best. There were bursts of connectivity, exchanges, and some of the earliest connections, of course, have to do with Buddhism. And it is to the likes of Kashyap Matanga and Dharmaratna that we give credit for having actually transmitted Buddhism in its earliest stages to China, and the reverse flow was also there in terms of the visits of scholars like Fa Xian and later Xuanzang, who came for reasons to do with their search for Buddhist texts, religious texts, philosophy. And these are what one might call anodyne, cultural, civilizational exchanges that are bereft of the whole notion of territory, frontiers, boundaries, borders. This concept didn't exist then. There was a free flow that took place for altogether different reasons. Not to do with the definition of nationhood, not to do with the definition of a geographical construct that defines our identity. And I would say that thereafter there was a hiatus for many centuries until the Middle Ages, when we see during the Ming Dynasty that Admiral Cheng He's much wanted voyages take place, including to our part of the world. Of the 7 voyages, apparently 3 touched this part of the world, including Hambantota and the Malabar coast. And there are some vestiges to suggest that this presence was there. But again, once the Ming decided that they no longer wanted to be a great maritime power, having realized that interacting with the outside world also meant that one would have to give and take, it's not all take. And trade, therefore, was towards the end of the Ming Dynasty actually seen as a burden. And they burnt all their boats, literally, leaving the Qing to what it was otherwise positioned for, which is to be a continental power, unlike the Ming, which had started out as a maritime power. Again, for centuries, we did not have very many contacts. And it is only the dawn of the 20th century that actually brings greater awareness in India about China and its struggle against colonialism, the collapse of the Qing, the rise of the Republic of China. On the reverse side, the Chinese are equally looking at the shrinking geography between India and China. The advent of technology, the airplane is permitting people to move rapidly and newspapers are bringing greater awareness, and people are speaking a more sort of global language in the 20th century, one that is looking at independence and removing the shackles of colonialism. So that's where the real connect starts in the 20th century. But there is an early, sort of medium of friction also at that time. The time when we are sympathizing in the opening decades of the 20th century with one another on broader issues. There is already a background, sort of friction taking place as a result of British colonial policies of the time. And we can see that the failure to negotiate a boundary, a clear-cut boundary between British India and China in the 19th century led to much greater friction in the following years, as in the 20th century. The Opium Wars, the treaties of Nanjing, 1842, the Treaty of Peking in 1860, and finally the 1898 Convention on Hong Kong, which also ensured that the whole of the new territories, 330 kilometers, also was handed over to the British. All this had already set up a period of considerable friction between the Qing dynasty in its dying days and a Curzonian view of British India that India was then taking, which of course ended abruptly with Curzon's departure. This is the period in which we also see that British Indian troops are being used to raise, for instance, the Summer Palace, around 1860. And once again, when the punitive mission is undertaken by the 8 nations following the Boxer Rebellion, it is the Rajputs and the Punjabis and the Sikhs who are actually entering as vanguard into Peking and fighting the wars from ditch to ditch against the Chinese people there. And I look back and wonder sometimes that when our troops faced off at Namkachu in 1962, and you have the Sikhs there and the Rajputs there and the Punjabis there, across Thagla, across Namkachu, I wonder if this played also a role in the Chinese imagination of India. And so therefore, we are looking at a dichotomous situation as the 20th century is unfolding. That there is goodwill between the two countries, but there is also this underlying tension that had set the stage for what is to follow. And that came later in quick succession. I want to, with this slide, draw upon the fact that there is a tendency in India, in my view at least, to overstate China's civilizational contributions. Little research has been done at our end to see what kind of contributions we have made, but it is not left to the imagination, because it's very clear how we have impacted through Buddhism on not only Southeast Asia, but also on China, Japan, Korea, and the rest of the world. It is really Indian civilization that has made a tremendous impact on China, and the Chinese are quite ready to acknowledge this also in a certain manner. Buddhism and Hindu-Buddhist thought and philosophy played a very big role, and India gave China knowledge and material items, Buddhism, philosophy, yoga, pranayam, dhyan meditation, which is known in China as Chan meditation, which ultimately went to Japan as Zen meditation. The fact of the matter is that Bodhidharma, who came from Mamallapuram, took dhyan meditation to Shaolin, and Shaolin then was not known for its, sort of kung fu or anything of the sort. It was known for dhyan meditation, that is Chan meditation. He never visited Japan, but his followers went to Japan and they took with them dhyan meditation, which was ultimately known in Japan as Zen Buddhism. And Bodhidharma himself is known in China as Tamo, and in Japan as Daruma, the ubiquitous Daruma doll in Japan, with the bushy eyebrows and the big bushy mustaches in a kind of seated posture. That is the Daruma, auspicious Daruma doll, is nothing but Bodhidharma. So these are the early impressions that we made on them. In the early stages, we didn't really quite get much from them. It is basically tea, peaches, pears, lychee, fishing nets in Kerala, sericulture, porcelain. All this came in, but India's impression and imprint was much deeper. And I read this Journey to the West English translation and some parts of the Chinese, written by Ming Dynasty author Wu Chang'an in the 16th century. His account, which is part fictional, of course, of Xuanzang's journey to India for scriptures in the 7th century, has so much to do with Indian culture. For when you look at the character Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, you cannot help feel that some of the description of his magical powers is identical to the description of the magical powers of Hanumanji. And that is the kind of imprint that we had on China. Now, I again want to bring you back to the 19th century, where I was trying to get you to understand that the underlying tensions, the seeds for this were sown in the 19th century. Because the British, once they took over Kashmir, had also tried to, after the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji and after the annexation of the Punjab, they inherited those borders in Ladakh as well, and had tried to propose, so what we call border commissions to the Qing. And the Qing had not taken the bait. Their standard line was always that the borders between us are well known, which is a way of, in a way, leaving things open for interpretation to advantage if necessary. The 1876 Anglo-Chinese Convention was actually aimed at forcing Tibet to trade with India. The irony here was that China had little sway in Tibet, and Britain also had little sway in Tibet. It was a fairly aggressive Tibet that was often seen as attacking, the neighboring protectorates of British India, such as Sikkim, and the British therefore wanted to do something about it. And they, in fact, kind of encouraged the Chinese to step in and enhance their presence and profile in Tibet. But it wasn't quite working. And once again in 1890, the convention was concluded with China by the British to get it to prevent Tibet's attacks on Sikkim and to remind them that you had made a promise in the 1876 Treaty of Chefu to help us trade with Tibet. And so much for China's claims that they had control over Tibet. They didn't quite have any control over Tibet. But that's a separate story as to what kind of control they had in Tibet and why did it take place, particularly in the 18th century. That was partly to do with the internecine fighting that was taking place among the Tibetan lamas, and particularly the post 6th Dalai Lama selection of the 7th Dalai Lama, with one interloper having been seen off and another one coming up as a candidate, and different factions were supporting different candidates. The Qing were brought in to deal with the Dzungar Mongols who had come to the aid and assistance of one of the factions. They made that a permanent or semi-permanent presence thereafter. So the point here I'm trying to make is that eventually, since China had failed to exercise any control over Tibet, notwithstanding the agreements that had been signed, ultimately Britain took matters into its own hands, and British India sent the Young Husband Mission in 1903, and he traveled all across and forced the court in Lhasa to sign the 1904 Lhasa Convention, which was stacked quite clearly against the Tibetans in terms of what it contained, because it had language to the effect of reparations of 25 lakhs and 75 years of occupation of the Chumbi. This was, of course, subsequently reduced to 3 years and 3 lakhs of rupees. The Anglo-Chinese Convention of 1906 undid some of the unique privileges that Britain had tried to seek through the 1904 Convention. And the last nail in the coffin was the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which very clearly said that neither side would do anything in Tibet without going through Peking. But the fact of the matter still remained that China was nowhere really in Tibet. But this fiction was there of Britain really having legitimized China's so-called control in Tibet. Now, when the Chinese troops entered Lhasa for the first time, and I'm dwelling a little bit on Tibet because it's impossible to speak of India-China relations without having truly tried to understand Tibet per se, or the history of India-Tibet relations. For everything is defined by the fact that we lost a certain buffer that we had throughout history. It's not the first time that the Dalai Lama came to India in 1959. For his predecessor, the 13th Dalai Lama had also fled to India in 1910 when Chao Feng's troops entered Lhasa for the first time in more than a century. And with the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911, Britain had also lost interest because by then Curzon had left India. And the world's attention was focused on the Great War that was unfolding in Europe. And at that point of time, Britain did make a belated attempt at trying to redefine the boundaries between inner and outer Tibet, which also alongside had the McMahon line as a sub-story between us and Tibet. Thereafter, we have seen that for a while thereafter, Britain did nothing to really establish a physical presence in areas that had been shown very clearly to be our side. That didn't necessarily make it Chinese territory. We have to remember that. The mere fact that we had not necessarily done anything does not make it necessarily Chinese. But one of the key points that I would like to posit here before you is that by the time we get to 1947 and 1949, it is for the very first time in history, it is for the very first time in millennia that India and China are thinking in terms of nationhood, in terms of modern boundaries, no longer in terms of the broad fluid concept of frontiers or broad fluid concepts of borders which have width, which are not necessarily delimited on maps or demarcated on the ground. We are now then talking about boundaries, specific lines without width, which are supposed to be delimited and demarcated, but the fact of the matter is that we didn't have such demarcation on the ground. And therefore, we see as the 50s unfold that we very quickly descend into that problem of defining our borders in terms of boundaries, more specifically. The one, I think, error of judgment made by India was that when our delegation went in 1953 to negotiate the Panchsheel agreement, they were specifically told to break contact if the question of boundary was raised. In other words, the Indian delegation in any case was not to discuss the boundary question. So sweeping it under the carpet did not really help, because on the Chinese side, there was a very clear ferment taking place to redefine their borders. They had already stepped into Xinjiang in 1949. They had moved into Tibet in October 1950, and they were determined to show their flag all along the frontier. There was a creeping presence that was already evident in places like Badahoti and even in the northeast of India, where, of course, Major Bob Khating and a column of the Assam Rifles had advanced ourselves there and positioned ourselves in Tawang as well in time. The rest, of course, is history. Now, the short point I want to make here about India-China relations in the early stages is that, broadly speaking, I feel that Pandit Nehru had, despite being well-intentioned, despite being such an erudite and sophisticated person, subordinated India's Tibet policy to his China policy. He had avoided antagonizing China, perhaps because he felt that it was better to have China as a cooperative country and didn't want to really alienate China. And India was also seeking, perhaps Pandit Nehru himself was positioning India and its leadership for a bigger role in the Korean crisis. And let the fact that India could not have played any role in the Korean crisis if one of the belligerents there, that is the People's Republic of China, had not accepted India as a role player. So therefore, one of the conditionalities there for India to play any kind of role in the Korean crisis was to have China's understanding on that. And I think that played a role in the subordination of Tibet to the broader China policy. I think there was also a failure to see the threat that was emerging from across the Himalayas, and we can see that in the systematic reduction of defense budgets, the lack of attention given to our armed forces during the 50s, such that when push came to shove, I think the armed forces did not quite have the wherewithal, either in terms of numbers or in terms of equipment, to actually meet the challenge. This matter was also compounded because till 1959, in fact, in the Western sector, it wasn't the army that was actually positioned there. It was the central police forces that were there. And it is only after the incident at Konkala in October 1959 that the army was asked to take over the border in Ladakh. In the eastern sector also, we have seen that it was all along Assam Rifles that was doing the job, and Assam Rifles was in fact under the Ministry of External Affairs until 1965 when it went to the Ministry of Home Affairs. So this was the kind of situation, and I would say that our own ability, our own outlook towards our boundary after independence was a little half-hearted. It was based on some kind of anticipated goodwill on the part of our neighbors, etc. So I feel that also played a role. Now, a word or two on Xinjiang, because it also has something to do with India-China relations. For without this buffer also having disappeared, we really wouldn't have a border with the People's Republic. So historically, it is my view that China had very loose control over what it called its Xinjiang, as in the new frontiers, and China's traditional borders were actually, in terms of the subcontinent, ended along the Kunlun. There are no maps that I have seen of the Qing which show China's boundaries going beyond the Kunlun. And it is a fact that during the short-lived East Turkestan Republic period of Yaqub Beg, around 1865 onwards, for a good 13-14 years, that place was kind of semi-independent or independent, you can say, and Kashmir's rule had moved up to all the way to Shahidullah across the Karakoram, and we did have a fair bit of sway in that area. In the late 19th century, the Qing troops had begun to show up at Shahidullah and later at the Karakoram Pass around 1892, 1893. And this was partly to do with the kind of encouragement that the British were giving to the Chinese to step in and do something, because the key objective of the British was not so much about whether the presence of China in these areas would be worrisome or not. They were more worried about the Russians, or keeping them at bay, and the presence of Dorjiev, of Russia, a Russian Buddhist, in the court of the 13th Dalai Lama around 1900, led the British to believe that something was afoot, and that the Russians were not only going to step into Xinjiang, but they would also have some kind of game plan with regard to Tibet to keep the Russians out of High Tartary. It is the British who therefore invited the Chinese to step in. The Chinese were quite glad to come in. Now, I want to again, like in a dream sequence, take you back to what I started out with, which is a changing global order. We spoke about that, a little referencing, but I would make this proposition that global orders are neither made nor dismantled easily. And one of the fundamental things that is a reality today is that the current order is still the one that was put in place in 1945, except for the changes that you mentioned, Dr. Mishra, and the ones that I mentioned at the ideational level, where democracy is no longer a monopoly of those who held that monopoly, at least in terms of the claim and the purloining and the reinterpretations, and economic development is also no longer the monopoly of the West or the capitalists or the democracy. So we have to keep that in mind. But the effective point is that other than that, the order is still the same. Now, if we look at the entry of the People's Republic of China in place of the Republic of China into the United Nations in 1971, one can readily acknowledge that, yes, by then China had acquired nuclear weapons, and the other four in any case had nuclear weapons by then. But the point I would like to make is that today's India is in many ways identical on all yardsticks to that China of 1971, being a large populous country, not necessarily very rich, but having all the potential that there is to be had, and having nuclear weapons. And yet it is India that does not quite make the cut. And China of 1971 made the cut, being a poor country with nuclear weapons. The ROC had made the cut in 1945, as in the old China had made that cut without nuclear weapons, without riches, simply being on the side of the victors. So something is wrong in terms of how the world order was constructed in 1945 and how it still remains the same in certain ways. The great contestation today in which India and China now find themselves together, and all of us are looking at this from different angles, is the contestation that is multifaceted on trade, a vector of the globalized world known as trade, another vector known as technology. Again, it's divisive. It is now causing the world to move into different camps, as in the Cold War in terms of the ideology. In terms of territory, territorial disputes are also coming to the fore, as we have seen that many parts of the world may have achieved much more in terms of economic progress, but less so in terms of creating sustainable security architecture. Our part of the world is one of the finest examples. And Southeast Asia is also another theater where they've done well with regard to economic development, but not necessarily so in terms of creating durable security architecture. There is the fourth T, apart from trade, technology, and territory, the T of tenets, which is dividing people. Tenets as in terms of the narrative, in terms of the models of growth and development and governance, where you find that the world is rapidly descending into camps, where the Chinese, particularly after the COVID pandemic, have been quite successful in convincing some countries around the world, the ones that have particularly been left out of the prosperity as a result of globalizations, the ones that didn't quite make it, they are also being convinced of China's narrative and propaganda, that the Chinese model is the one which actually delivers growth and development. And the T of terrorism remains a constant. It has changed its shapes and presence in different parts of the world, but there's a certain constancy to that challenge also as we look ahead. So these are the T's that I would like to leave with you: trade, technology, territory, tenets, and terrorism. Within all these, there is a certain amount of grating that is taking place between India and China as well, in terms of the broadest context. And this is partly because a very fragile international compact that existed prior to the pandemic on account of growing friction between the United States and China, the trade war, etc., has been further weakened by the pandemic. There is more multi-polarity today, less multilateralism, although there are attempts to revive the multilateralism at the level of the UN, and that has come about with the departure of President Trump and the arrival of President Biden and the reinsertion of the United States in some of these global structures as an active participant. The pandemic politics have, of course, divided the world, and critical supply chains are, of course, the main issue on which we are all focused. Now, here the key point is that in our part of the world, China has not only emerged as the world's second largest economy, it is the world's largest trading partner. It is also the fulcrum around which the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, has been constructed. And having achieved that, it has also sought to now become a member of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the US, the world's biggest economy, is part of neither. And that is something that we have to keep in mind. India is also, as you know, part of neither at the moment. And so in some ways, we can take a fresh look at our options. How is it that we want to reinsert ourselves in the dynamic economic processes that are taking place, where it is China that is emerging as a key fulcrum, and we are still on the extreme periphery of that process. The Indo-Pacific has no doubt emerged as a new theater of geopolitical contestation, in which again India and China are grating against each other. And here I would like to simply make 2 points. First, that the concept of Asia-Pacific, in fact, had a historical context from roughly the end of the Second World War till the end of that century, the last century. It is, in fact, the US presence in the region, its military and physical presence, it's opening up its market to first Japan, thereafter the Asian tigers, thereafter to the People's Republic of China, that occasioned the rise of the concept of the Asia-Pacific. But today that economic growth is more widespread. It has gone beyond East Asia to Southeast Asia to South Asia, all the way to the east coast of Africa. And therefore the Indo-Pacific, with the reality being that on all those vectors that I mentioned, the two oceans are conjoined, whether it's trade, technology, terrorism, territory, disputatious aspects, we are conjoined. What happens in one part of the Indian Ocean has an impact on what happens in the Pacific and vice versa. And so it is therefore the Indo-Pacific that is the current, contemporary, more representative, more democratic, more inclusive concept. It is the Asia-Pacific concept to which China seems to be still wedded, which in my view is an outdated concept which had its time under the sun. There is a lot of talk about China's growing naval prowess, and I want to just mention one broad point here, that it's a reality that China has transformed its brown water navy into a blue water navy, expanded its strategic concepts from operating in the near sea environment to what it calls the far seas environment. It has now developed a very, very large fleet of surface and subsurface combatants, the world's largest, so to speak. 350 ships and submarines, and still growing, and over 130 major surface combatants. But the key point here is that it is still the US Navy which is the largest in terms of absolute tonnage. The US Navy, despite having fewer ships, is still twice the tonnage, even today, of the large and emerging Chinese Navy, and far more sophisticated in terms of the fact that its its aircraft carriers, the smallest one would be at least twice as large as the largest one that the Chinese have, and far more sophisticated in terms of its protective suites, etc., as well as the array of electronic and other kinetic weapons that it would carry on board. At the end of the day, one has to also keep in mind that the Indo-Pacific is a concept that has been created as a result of China's rise, and it is China's spilling over from its original geography into a broader geography as a result of its economic and military ambitions that is actually defining the Indo-Pacific. So it is not as if others have created the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific has been partly created because of that spreading prosperity which now envelopes a much larger region and the interconnectedness of things that I mentioned, but it is also a result of what China is doing today in terms of its spilling over into the Indian Ocean, its spillover into the South China Sea, its acquisition of certain territories, its own redefinition of its strategic objectives, the primary one today being to keep the United States away from its periphery, to limit the extent of US power in the Pacific, and particularly on its periphery, is a primary Chinese objective, and it has partially succeeded in doing that. And I would say this because notwithstanding the US determination to pitchfork back into the Indo-Pacific, as Biden has said, and as Secretary of State Blinken is saying even now on his visit to Indonesia and some other countries in Southeast Asia, the fact of the matter is that you cannot undo what has been done. The acquisition of artificial islands, creation of certain military facilities there is a fact that cannot be undone. You cannot put the genie back into the bottle. Freedom of navigation operations, for instance, that the United States and others conduct are very good demonstrators of the illegality of China's claims, but they do little to reverse the logic of the Chinese presence in the South China Sea. So that is something that we must keep in mind. Again, it is China and its rise and the perception of the rise of China and the search for options to deal with that rise of China that has led to concepts, structures, dialogues such as the Quad Security Dialogue, the Malabar Naval Exercise, and finally the more definitive defense pact known as AUKUS. The BRI, of course, is the sort of 800-pound gorilla, and it's the elephant in the room, because the Chinese have used over time their enormous economic resources, deep pockets, to not only seek to create new markets for their products, but also to give a certain kind of vent to their excess capacities, manufacturing capacities across China, and also to create a certain China-centric standardization for manufactured goods and for digital highways in the future. and that is at the heart of the BRI, to create a new sort of web of interconnectedness, which once was simply to be seen and felt on China's immediate borders, but today much beyond that, all the way up to Europe, all the way up to Africa, all the way up to South Asia, with the focus there being China at front and center of that new web of interconnectedness, in terms of manufacturers, in terms of exports, in terms of standards, in terms of digital highways, etc. China's future trajectory, from my point of view, should be seen in light of three phases of Chinese history post the emergence of the People's Republic of China. Phase one is from 1949 to 1979, which in many ways was a unmitigated disaster for the people of China, with the anti-rightist movement, Great Leap Forward, the famines, the ravages of the Cultural Revolution, internecine wars between the Red Guards, what have you. But it was also a period of what you call geographical consolidation, a stand-up China period under Mao. So Mao kind of united China, and Xinjiang and Tibet were kind of brought into the fold. So it had its plus side as well. The second phase is the one in which between 1979 and 2009, straddling the two global economic and financial crises, you have a period of unbridled economic growth in China, double-digit growth rates, and what we might say is the Midas touch that China developed. With anything that China did turned to gold. Everything was very successful. So this is a period that followed the stand-up China period in terms of what you will call the economic prosperity of China. And it was quite conclusive in many ways, this prosperity, because that is what led China to be extremely confident after 2008, when it saw that the traditional engines of global economic growth, Western economies no less, the United States no less, were actually faltering, and that China had the means and the structures in place already, in the absence of the US on its periphery also, on account of the global war on terror, that China found that niche to project itself into that space, having cast aside the old dictum of Deng Xiaoping that you hide your capacities and bide your time. They came into this. Yes, thank you. The third period is phase 3, 2009 onwards. That is the period in which China has now, as I suggested to you, become far more confident, far more aggressive, and this has also been compounded by a certain, centralized, nature of power in China on account of the emergence of a strong and sort of central figure in China in President Xi Jinping. The history of rising powers, when you study Japan, post Meiji Restoration, and particularly in the opening decades of the 20th century, or if you study Wilhelmine Germany in the opening decade of the 20th century, when it competed for naval supremacy with Great Britain, and if the British made these large dreadnought, ships with their big guns, the Germans were doing likewise. And there was a search for a hinterland there also, including the search for acquiring extraterritorial resources and influence in Africa, as far away as in Africa. All that reminds us that, and the history of what followed thereafter reminds us that there is no guarantee of success in China. And we must continue to draw a distinction between China as a civilization that is, like an endless river flowing through centuries and millennia. Then there is the Communist Party of China, which has now completed a century. And then there are the human beings in the forms of leaders like President Xi Jinping, who obviously, compared to China as a civilization and the Chinese Communist Party as a political entity, have more finite time frames to work in, And that, in my view, also leads to question marks on the ultimate outcomes. I don't want to go into too many slides if I've actually completed my remarks over 45 minutes. So if you want to quickly get into discussions, I could do that as well. The last point I want to make here is that the major goals of the Xi Jinping era, the first centenary goal has been achieved, 2020, in fact, it was achieved by 2019, making China a moderately well-off society. 2021 is the centenary of the CCP that is being celebrated. 2025 Made in China, that's the program that was launched in 2015 with focus on high technology manufacturing in 10 sectors particularly. 2027 will mark the centenary of the PLA, and that's the one to watch out for, because China will also want to demonstrate a certain amount of how shall I say, military prowess in the run-up till then. 2035 again, it's a twin goal of making China a modern socialist country and modernization of the PLA. And 2049, the second centenary goal of achieving the China dream, making it modern and rejuvenated. But here, the catch over here is, the fly in the ointment in my view here is that can China actually achieve the China dream without reunification with Taiwan? And if so, which Chinese leader is going to stand on the podium there and declare that we have actually achieved the great China dream if Taiwan is still not reunited? And in geostrategic terms, it also means that between 2021 and 2049, somewhere in this period, you will have to look for the changes that are around the corner. And I have no doubt that things will happen before that. 1 or 2 minutes more, if you don't mind.
Please go ahead.
See, the Galwan episode, as you all know, has induced great distrust. The consensus that existed during Rajiv Gandhi's visit, as a result of that visit, of which I was a part in 1988, has collapsed. That consensus was that we can actually work together on a broad front and areas to improve our ties without necessarily holding to ransom the relationship on account of our bilateral boundary dispute. This was not to say that the boundary dispute would not be discussed, but that we would continue our discussions on the boundary question, that we would have a joint working group on the boundary question, which later also had a subgroup called the Expert Group of Diplomatic and Military Officials, which I also headed between 1996 and 2000 for 4 years. But that alongside, we will not prevent the overall development of our relations. Today, we are back to square one, where it is very clear that without there being peace and tranquility in the border areas, there cannot be any basis for normalization of relations. This is very important from our point of view. Why the Chinese did what they did, you are all well-informed people, and so much has been said about it that there is no point in my repeating it. But obviously, there is also reason here to believe that the Chinese may have miscalculated. And certainly, I don't think the Chinese expected that India would come up with a robust response. I think the robustness of our response is a shade ahead of what they might have expected, because the Chinese also believe that they know us, they read us very well. They have many constituencies in India. They are well informed. So some parts of our reaction would have also taken them by surprise, the robustness particularly of the military response. And I think that is the right thing that the government of India did. There is a unilateral concept of the LAC that the Chinese promote time and again. And let me just make one broad point over here that, see, the LAC was never a concept for us. All of you who have read our history of India-China boundary negotiations, you should know that till the mid-70s, we always referred to the line of actual control as the so-called line of actual control, because our concept was always the international boundary, whether in the western sector, along the Kunlun, or in the eastern sector, along the watershed. It was essentially the international boundary. IB is what we went by. But because the Chinese had created a certain situation as a result of the aggression in the 1950s and through 1962, the occupation of a large part of our territory known as Aksai Chin, we had to live with that concept called the line of actual control. And the Chinese, of course, had several interpretations of the same line. Let me put it this way. The Chinese always gave a sufficiently clear definition of their line of actual control so as to claim territory, but a sufficiently unclear and vague definition of the line of actual control so as never to be bound down by a specific particular line on the ground, leaving open the possibility that they could interpret that line on the ground in the future. So there was this very insidious way of projecting the LAC, sufficiently clear to claim territory, but sufficiently unclear so as to be able to reinterpret it on the ground when the advantages presented themselves. Dialogue has not been ruptured, which is the good thing between India and China. After all, we seek peace with all our neighbors, including with China. And I think broadly speaking, there is an emerging consensus between the two sides at the end of, I would say, 23 rounds of the working mechanism, that is the WMCC, and 13 rounds of the Corps Commanders dialogue, that there should be a peaceful resolution. Some positive steps have been taken in certain areas, such as the south bank of Pangong, and we hope that there are other areas also, apart from hot springs, etc., where the matter can also be resolved at an early date. And we will continue to have to deal with China's rise, again along these vectors: territory, technology, trade, tenets. But I will add two more here this time, and I'll leave out terrorism. Transparency. Whenever China makes inroads into the Indian Ocean region, into South Asia, which is perhaps a natural corollary of the rise of a certain power in economic and military terms, it must also be cognizant of the fact that others will react. And others will particularly react if this rise and spillover is not transparent enough. And that means that if China has a BRI which has CPEC front and center as one of its key planks, there should have been a sufficient level of dialogue between them and us on this particular project. It was not the case. When they come into the Indian Ocean after a gap of 6 centuries, because the last time we saw the Chinese in these waters was when Changhe came, right, in the 15th century. But then they come in the 21st century without so much as a buy or leave. It is obviously like waving a red rag before a bull, because they come in with a submarine in 2013, ostensibly to fight pirates who are in small skiffs and boats. Whoever heard of submarines coming in to fight pirates in skiffs? And so certainly something is afoot in terms of a larger requirement of gaining bases like Djibouti and elsewhere, and Gwadar, and to use the anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden as an independent navy. The Chinese have a permanent flotilla of 3 ships there in the Indian Ocean at any given point of time now. This ought to have been done with much greater transparency, for the lack of transparency has created a great deal of mistrust and uncertainty on the part of India and many others. And trust, of course, there is a great deal of trust in the multilateral space now, because we always felt that we had problems at the bilateral level, but there were larger issues on which India and China could work together. But with the kind of activism that China has shown at the UN, particularly in the aftermath of the resigning of Article 370, we have reason to believe that this multilateral space has also shrunk. It has not only shrunk because of China's behavior at the UN and its activism and its pro-Pakistani proclivities at the UN to trigger off discussions on Kashmir, etc. But it is also a function of China having moved away from India in terms of its economic and other indices in the last 15 to 20 years, such that China feels it no longer really requires that broad constituency with another large developing country like India to deal with broader issues. It has enough confidence today, it feels, to deal with those on its own, whether it's climate change or whether it is South-South cooperation or other economic issues. So that is broadly what I had to say. 30 seconds more on this. There are 6 resets in our relations. 1947 and 1949, which I touched upon, was a major reset in over 2 millennia of our ties. We had to come to terms as what we call modern states in a strictly Westphalian kind of context for the first time. A Westphalian interpretation of our identities had to take place in 1947 and 1949. We're talking about borders, national identity, modern states. 1962, the India-China war. The mistrust that was created then still lasts and is felt today in our everyday interactions with China. The Rajiv Gandhi visit to Beijing in 1988, the consensus of which collapsed so quickly and will not be revived very soon unless the Chinese also step back from their positions. 98, the nuclear test was another reset, fundamental reset in terms of the strategic underpinnings of our relationship. And then, of course, Doklam, to a certain extent, demonstrating India's ability to stand by others when their territory was also being nibbled at on account of our close relations with Bhutan. And 2020, of course, is the very fundamental change that has crept in. I'll thank you all very much for hearing me very patiently. I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chinoy. It was a really fascinating lecture for all of us. I'm sure everybody has enjoyed it very much, and there will be questions and comments for you. May I now please go ahead.
Sir, our major concern is how to balance China in the region. We have two vectors, key vectors, engagement and military capability. We are doing very well on the engagement side, and we are doing well on military capability side in recent years also. We are doing well. But looking the Chinese strategy, Chinese plan to develop its military capabilities, particularly naval capabilities, how do you see gap between Indian military capability and Chinese military capability in 2050? You don't think this is a major concern for China?
You mean major concern for India?
Sorry, major concern for
yes.
India.
Any other question? Okay, we can take a couple if you want and then answer. Go ahead. Be very brief, huh?
Yes. Sir, recently we all have seen China launched hypersonic light vehicle missile, and the US general, one of the US general also remarked that a Sputnik moment. This is like a Sputnik moment. So, sir, how do you locate India in the coming Cold War 2.0, about which many scholars are also divided? One say this is imminent, one say it will come, or one say it is not there, whatever it is. But how do you locate India? Because we also have to realize the fact that China is our neighbor, so, and we cannot totally align with US as far as China is concerned. And the second question is one more question about, can we say, just like after the disintegration of USSR, Francis Fukuyama term that end of history, so can we say, sir, realism is the only paradigm that is relevant in international relations, and the paradigm like liberalism is just in the garb of liberalism also only realism is played out?
All right.
No, how do we deal with China? As you said, engagement is one way, developing military capability. Yes, engagement with like-minded countries is one way, in your view, and developing military capabilities to deal with China either singly or again in tandem is another way, right? I also want to give a very brief answer to this. While both of these are correct, I'll say that asymmetry is not necessarily an impediment in dealing with absolute gaps in power. Let me give you an example. With a few bombs in the basement and a few missiles to be able to deliver those bombs, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was able to get President Trump to sit across the table on more than one occasion. Right? So, to me, that example is one. Another example is that we have absolute asymmetry in terms of economic and military power between India and Pakistan. Yet, on a certain border that we call the line of control, it is a given fact that over time, the Pakistanis, despite being geographically maybe 9 times, smaller than India, and in economic terms also perhaps 8-9 times smaller than India, have been able to create a certain symmetry on the border, despite the overall asymmetry in power. In many ways, I feel that they're being. All right, did everybody miss everything then?
No.
Right, okay. I hope the others who are logged in could have heard that as well.
They have heard.
So in many ways, I would say that there is an asymmetry between India and China. And yet, as far as our northern borders are concerned, in the post-Galwan phase, we have demonstrated a capacity to equalize. Gun for gun, tank for tank, soldier for soldier. So I gave you two other examples which will help you understand how absolute gaps in military power or economic power can also be dealt with appropriately in asymmetrical ways. And I'm not talking about asymmetry that takes us in the direction of, cyber warfare and other, where also states and non-state actors are able to bridge the absolute gaps through asymmetrical means. So I think this effort must continue. And alongside, there is no gainsaying the fact that we have to develop our economy at a brisk pace and find enough resources to spare, weighing all other requirements with consideration. We have to spare enough resources for our military budgets. Cold War 2.0 and where we locate India. Look, I think we are living in an age where there is, as I said earlier, more multipolarity than ever before. The so-called world order is today neither truly, you cannot call it bipolar. It is not unipolar at all, and it is not truly multipolar yet, though there are many poles emerging. There are pole positions being taken by middle powers also in their own regions. And because of this ability to bridge the absolute gap through asymmetrical means, everyone's playing a major role. Multi-alignment is the order of the day. I don't think that we are looking at a Cold War 2.0 as such, because if you were to grant that proposition, you are also granting that there is bipolarity. And you're also granting that essentially the United States of America and China will have complete sway over their own constituencies in the manner in which the United States and the Soviet Union once exercised their constituencies. I think what we will see eventually is issue-based alignments, multi-alignments, permutations and combinations, because today the world is conjoined at the hips in economic terms with both the United States and China, and the two of them are more conjoined at the hips like Siamese twins than anybody else. So in this kind of a world, I cannot imagine a Cold War 2.0. I can imagine a world in which there will be camps on different issues with different permutations and different combinations. People will come into the room and leave the room depending on their own requirements.
Is there any online question, Subhashji? I think we'll wait for online questions. In the meantime, I had a couple of thoughts of my own. You rightly mentioned that despite being a very erudite man, Nehru grievously erred in sort of calculating how China will behave, especially because probably he could not understand that there may be a full-fledged invasion from China. Of course, his skirmishes had been happening for many years. That, of course, is there. But what we see is that, and I think you have referred to it in the earlier part of your presentation, that from the 19th century onward, we see a certain, overemphasis on historical relations, good relations, harmonious relations between India and China, and you have talked about it. And in fact, even now we see that so many Indian scholars, they tend to overemphasize the contribution of the Chinese civilization to India. And we know that this Sinophilia has continued right up to our own times. And it is only recently now that, some kind of a transition seems to be taking place. So I wanted to get your response on what you think are the core factors behind what I very mildly describe as, Sinophilia present in India. Do you think there are any deeper factors behind it, or is it?
No, I think there are essentially two factors. One is the obvious demonstration of success that the Chinese have been able to project in terms of eradication of poverty, in terms of providing a certain measure of livelihood for their people, creation of infrastructure, and this is what you would call in judgmental terms ideology agnostic. You're only looking at what is the end result, that there are roads there, there is a certain degree of welfare in place, and this obviously is a very enticing and attractive proposition for many people around the world. So that is one part of the picture in terms of how they have been able to do it. The second part, of course, is the projection, the propaganda, the ability to spend money, loan money to countries that need developmental finance, and which these countries have not been able to get enough of that from, say, the traditional, Bretton Woods structures. At least they won't get that without there being riders and conditionalities attached in terms of good governance and things like that, democratization of their polity. So it is easier for these countries to get this kind of developmental finance from China, and so that too makes it very attractive. The price that has to be paid, it comes much later. Perhaps, in fact, the next generation pays that price, because when these loans cannot be paid back in time, or these loans cannot be serviced, it immediately transforms into a certain erosion of territorial sovereignty and also economic sovereignty, sometimes sovereignty over natural resources that otherwise you hold. So, but I think it's a fatal attraction for many, and the Chinese are also spending very large amounts of money, and this is not only in developing countries, even in the West, in the United States of America. You have that book by James Mann, wasn't it, in 2007 or so, The China Fantasy.
Yeah.
And so even the Americans have been obviously carried away with this kind of.
You used a very interesting term, a fatal attraction, and of course, in the present context, you have very sort of broadly explained why this attraction is there, because of so many things that China has been able to do, and the way that it has been able to do a certain outreach to different parts of the world. But I would also like to get your response on the larger context of modern India. Like, you take the example of Tagore. Of course, we talk about Nehru because Nehru was the prime minister. But you take the example of Tagore, you take the example of most other thinkers of modern India. How did they think about China? If I see it, I would say more or less, they all thought about China in very, very positive terms. I would say, I would personally say that probably it was a kind of, a too positive an assessment of China on the part of Tagore, even on the part of a man like Lohia, who was more realistic. So, is it that there was a certain trajectory which we started off, say, in the late 19th century, and we have continued, and only now we are changing?
Look, my own view is on this particular point that China has always been seen as a very large, enigmatic, populous, agrarian country that was generally seen as the counterfoil to all that Western society stood for at the other end. And we have seen that China did not get fully colonized, but parts of China were colonized. And so there was that uneasy coexistence, and the plight of China was romanticized periodically by Western missionaries who thought that this was a wonderful opportunity to proselytize, and there was a lot of activity, you are aware, in China in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, the Jesuits and the others, and so the romanticization of Chinese culture has a history to it. You've seen some of that in the writings of, in a way, for the American audience, writings of Pearl Buck, in the more, in terms of agrarian society, large Asian agrarian society. So you'd think of Pearl Buck. Then when you look at the romanticization of the Chinese Communist Party, then you would immediately think of Edgar Snow, and how he brought a romanticized notion of the party and Mao and his heroic, pursuits at Yan'an and all to an American audience that was otherwise seeing the first stirrings of communism in America, but also dreading it. The kind of process that later led to the McCarthyism and the discourse on what they call the Red Scare of the 1940s and 50s. So that brought about a certain notion of China, which has subsequently been, I think, perpetuated by its ability as a conformist, homogeneous society under the leadership of an iconic person like Mao to take on the United States of America and Korea with just dry rations of rice and rifles, and to, if necessary, plunge to their doom in the face of modern American weapons. That too gave a romanticized notion of China. The upheavals there in China, the kind of pain that they were capable of inflicting on one another through violence, also created a certain, macabre kind of curiosity about that society in the West, which does not come easily to others when they're looking at a more benign society like India, where we are not going to slit each other's throats all the time. But don't forget that the Chinese history is a violent history. All political change in China has always come through a degree of violence. And when we juxtapose that against our own experience, nothing could be more different, because the Indian experience in the early part of the 20th century was exactly the opposite when we are looking for Swaraj and independence. And Gandhiji is talking about turning the other cheek in biblical terms, and not, sort of engaging in violence. On the other hand, Mao speaks of power flowing from the barrel of a gun, and he is describing revolution as being something quite different. He said that revolution is not a dinner party. It's not as leisurely an activity as painting or embroidery or a nice dinner party. It is meant to be violent. So I think violence also has added to China's sort of mystery and enigma in that sense. Lack of transparency has added to it. You cannot read into that society, a monolithic society, mired in Confucian ways. But speaking of Pandit Nehru, he also, I think, had developed, scholars may correct me if I'm wrong, but a fairly romanticized notion of Chinese communism as early as the meeting that he had attended in 1927 or so.
Exactly.
It was a world communist, international
conference against imperialism,
etc. So I think he had been fairly enamored of what he had seen and felt, and he too described China as a great and powerful nation, and must be integrated into.
And Ambassador Chinoy, your answer takes me, to another very important question. You rightly say that because of this romanticization, a certain notion of China was created. Now, do you think that China has actually internalized this romanticized notion of itself, created primarily by the West, and then, of course, also adopted by many other people? And that is one of the main reasons that China is looking at its past, not so much through its own eyes, but through the eyes of others, and the centrality that it is sort of according to itself in the long human history is very substantially a creation of the West. Because if we look at it, China was a comparatively isolated civilization, geographically speaking, because on the northern borders it had to face, Siberia, deserts, nomads, etc. It did not have much of a contact as far as Central Asia is concerned with the other civilizations. Its contact was very, very limited. And of course, it was only during brief periods in its history that China was a great sea power. For most of its history, it was a coastal sea power only. And there were other intermediaries as far as trade is concerned who were really important. So, do you think that an important role in this is being played by the Chinese internalization of this romanticized notion, which has convinced them that they were always center of the world and therefore they must regain it?
In a way, I think the notion of the Middle Kingdom predates their, sort of global interactions that came much later. These global interactions and the prisms through which foreigners saw China may have reinforced that impression. But the notion of Middle Kingdom, you are aware that it predates this.
Yes, it
because
predates.
when we look at Qianlong and the manner in which he received the McCartney mission, trade mission, in the last decade of the 18th century. This is after the Gorkha Wars, as in the Nepal-Tibet War of 1788, 1792. A couple of years thereafter, when Qianlong was still alive, he had received the McCartney mission. And McCartney had been told that China didn't need anything from the outside world. It had all the wares it wanted. It didn't want to trade with the outside world. So, but the Middle Kingdom syndrome of isolation, of superiority, of being in some kind of a hierarchy, but at the top, is an intrinsic part of Chinese culture. Your other point, I think, is also equally true, that China's original experience is limited to dealing with its periphery.
Yes,
it had an obsession with its periphery, truly speaking, and it used the encirclement concepts of its own historical past to deal with its periphery, whether it was the White Huns or whether it was the Xiongnu, on its borders, the result of which they had to build the Great Wall. But there were moments in this when they were able to get out of that and create passages to deal with the West, as when Marco Polo might have visited, China, or when their people came to, India, as in visiting what they called Xitian and Tianchu. India was known as Tianchu. So there were moments when they sallied forth into the broader world, but at the end of the day, it was the Middle Kingdom, I think, predates the Western notion of.
No, I quite agree with you. What I was thinking was, that China basically dealt with a series of small countries on its borders, and obviously most of them recognized China as the dominant power, and that was the idea on which Middle Kingdom was based. But when China started dealing with the larger world, it kind of transposed that idea of Middle Kingdom to the larger world. So a kind of historical disjuncture happened. What was true about the periphery of China, then in China's own mind became true about the rest of the world, that China had been the dominant power or civilization in human history for the entire world. So I was talking about that departure.
You're right, because in a way, the Chinese have a very deep sense of the century of humiliation, because they feel it's a point of inflection. They feel that before that, China was, hierarchically a very superior power. It gave a lot. When it saw Japan as a recipient, not as a giver, a recipient of everything that I just mentioned: Buddhism, Zen, Tang culture, calligraphy, you name it. But the shock of losing to Japan in 1895 in the naval battle and the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the loss of Chinese influence over Formosa, the loss of Chinese influence over the Korean Peninsula to a preeminent power called Japan. Then seeing Japan defeat a white power in 1905 when Japan defeated the Russians. See, this would have gone down very, very badly with the Chinese. When Sun Yat-sen came to power, in 1911 and the Republic of China was formed in 1912. It was his dream to clone China on the lines of Japan. He had been educated in Japan. He had seen the Western world. He had practiced the Christian faith. And Sun Yat-sen wanted actually to make China follow Japan's footsteps. Japan had a head start after the Meiji Restoration. Japan had built big naval ships in British and French shipyards in the latter part of the 19th century. And by the opening decades, even Rabindranath Tagore had to say in, I think, 1916 or so, that he was worried about militarization in Japan. If you remember one of his essays on his visit to Japan, and he spoke about his fears that one day Japan may have to, all this will go up in fire and smoke, and it kind of, presciently spoke prophetically of what was to follow many years later as being the results of Japanese militarization. So I think that century of humiliation, of the feeling that China had lost its centrality, allowed them again enough, to repossess a certain vigor, to demonstrate their centrality. I think they've gone overboard with that also.
Thank you very much. I believe there are no further questions. So once again, I take this opportunity for thanking Ambassador Chinoy and all other members of the audience who are present, whether in the hall or online. It has been a great lecture and very, very interesting discussion for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.